the issues affecting Asia's animals and the stories of the people working on their behalf. We'll be taking you on a tour of what's been happening lately in the animal protection space around Asia and also bringing you updates from our huge network of animal protection organizations and our many working groups. Welcome to the Asia for Animals podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the AFA podcast. My name is Pavitra, and I'm a coordinator at the Capacity in Animal Protection Coalition at Asia for Animals. And today's episode is a special one because we are going to be discussing the capacity and funding landscape of the Asian farm animal movement based on our recently released report by the same name. You can find the report on our website or head to farmanimalcoalition.com/reports. I'm thrilled to be joined by two very special guests today who are not just deeply involved in the farm animal advocacy movement in Asia through their work, but also happen to be the co-authors of the report. First off, we have Jessika Ava, the CEO of Thrive Philanthropy, an organization that accelerates alternatives to industrial animal agriculture and creates just plant-based food systems through equitable grant making and movement building. Jessika has worked in global philanthropy sector since 2010 and has extensive experience living and working in Southeast Asia. Welcome, Jessika.
Hi, Pavitra. It's so nice to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. So we also have with us Wanyi Zeng. Wanyi is the Executive Director of Welfare Matters and plays a pivotal role in guiding the organization by setting its strategic direction and overseeing its growth. Welfare Matters is currently dedicated to capacity building in the farmed animal protection movement in Southeast Asia. Wanyi's commitment to effective altruism is deeply rooted in her journey. She co-founded Effective Altruism Singapore, which has now evolved into Welfare Matters.
Hi, Pavitra. Nice to be on your podcast.
So glad to have you with us, Wanyi. All right, so before we dive into the report, can you both tell us a little bit more about yourselves and your respective organizations? Maybe we can start with you, Jessika. What inspired you to work on the funding side of the farmed animal advocacy movement?
Yes, absolutely. So as you shared, I am the founder and CEO of Thrive Philanthropy. And Thrive is a grant-making organization and movement-building organization. So we work with major foundations and support in getting grants to organizations all across the world. And currently, we are funding about 1 out of every 3 countries of the world. And we provide funding for any type of works that overcomes factory farming, supports in plant-based advocacy, and so forth. So essentially, our aim is to reduce the consumption of animals and reduce factory farming and create more just and sustainable plant-based food systems. And like you shared, I have been working in the animal and vegan funding space for about 15 years, and I live part-time in Asia as well. So I've been observing the movement across Asia for many, many years, and it's just been a pleasure to work on this report with AFA.
Thank you so much, Jessika. Likewise, it was a pleasure working with you as well, and we are so glad that the report is finally out. Yeah, so the same question to you, Wanyi. Can you tell us a little bit more about Welfare Matters and a little bit more about the fellowship programs that you offer there, and what are some of the key objectives that you aim to achieve through these fellowships?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm based in Singapore and I run Welfare Matters. Welfare Matters, before it was Welfare Matters, we were originally an effective altruism chapter in Singapore. But a few years ago, we spotted the opportunity to do capacity building for the farmed animal welfare space in Southeast Asia. And we started with a fellowship program called the Southeast Asia Farm Animal Welfare Fellowship. And that's mainly what Welfare Matters have been doing. But this year, growing our capacity building program, we are also having an incubation program that's completely new and is going to start next week, actually. And on top of all these, we do a little bit of research just because we find that there is quite a lot of knowledge gaps about what's going on with the industrial animal agriculture in this region. And we're trying to be as Asia contextualized as possible in our programs. Yeah, and the fellowship programs that we offer, it's mostly trying to bring into the movement more professionals who can work more in the farmed animal welfare advocacy space. Although we do see fellows who work in the plant-based movement as well, as some people are interested in alternative protein and capacity building, community building in general. We have a 14-week program that's happening once a week when we run it. It's mostly in English, but last year and this year, we tried to also have one version in Vietnamese. And this year, we are completing one version in Indonesian, Bahasa Indonesia. And the reasons for having these fellowships are to try to bring in the local talent pool, people interested in doing more for farmed animals, who are locally based and who are interested to learn more and help them open up their network through these platforms. So over the 14 weeks, they learn a lot about the welfare issues of the animals farmed in this region. And they also would find out more about what kinds of interventions have been working. And they also then get to do some project proposals as an assignment to reflect on what they've learned and think about what they might want to do if they get to implement the projects. So the Bahasa Indonesia Fellowship is trying to capture the talent pool who have all these interests, but who might not be fluent in English. And we're trying to bring down the language barrier for people in Indonesia as well as in Vietnam through having local language fellowships. And we depend a lot on our program coordinators to be the bridge for our program and the local fellows. The key objectives that we want to achieve is to be able to increase the number of people who are ready to work in farmed animal advocacy roles in the different organizations in this region. And I think we still have a lot of learning to do so far. But yeah, we are seeing some progress for some of our fellowships.
Thank you so much, Wanyi. That sounds amazing. And it also sounds like you're doing so much. And congratulations on the new program that you're launching next week. So yeah, one of the key findings of the report is that the sector relies almost entirely on Western grant-making organizations. But the global distribution of funds remains vastly sort of misaligned with that of the issue. So much so that we remain at a situation where roughly 8% of the currently available funds are reaching the region where 75% of the issue exists. So can you share your perspective on the current funding landscape for farmed animal advocacy in Asia, and how do you see it evolving in the next few years? Maybe we can start with you, Jessika.
Yes, absolutely. So I've observed over the last 3 to 5 years or so that there's been quite an increase in funding going to the farmed animal welfare space and the vegan advocacy space. And prior to that, most funding was going towards companion animals, wild animals, and so forth. But over the last few years, we've seen this increase in farmed animal work and vegan advocacy work. So as you can imagine, this has enabled several organizations to begin to grow and expand their projects, and has really enabled us to start reaching more Asian countries with the farmed animal and vegan movement. And another thing that I have noticed, that not only are there more domestic organizations, grassroots organizations starting to receive funding, but I've also noticed that there are more international chapters from these large Western international organizations. More international chapters of these large groups are beginning to open organizations within various Asian countries as well. So one important thing that I have noted about this growth is that even though it's been, remarkable to see more funding going into the region, I've also noticed that growth isn't always necessarily sustainable. And what I mean by that is I've observed a number of organizations that some major foundations will come in and provide a significant amount of funding to these groups. It means that they're able to expand their projects, hire new staff, and so forth. But at times, sometimes that funding isn't long-term. So that funding lasts a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, and then the funding is declined, or maybe it's rescinded altogether. And this kind of leaves organizations in this situation then that they're suddenly having to decline their work, lay off staff, and so forth. So it has been a bit challenging at times to sustain this growth in a healthy manner. And with this sustainability, when it comes to funding, unfortunately, the organizations themselves, they may not necessarily have the ability to find alternative funding streams when they're giving such a large amount of funding. They may not have the ability to find alternative funding streams quick enough to when that funding, that large amount of funding is reduced or revoked, they may not be able to catch up in another way with another funder. So it does leave it a bit of a situation where it can be challenging at times. So how I see it evolving in the next few years, a lot of it depends on funders as well. And that's, one of the important aspects of this report is that a lot of it will depend on how much funders are willing to put into the Asian movement, and then also how much funders are willing to consider how to sustain that funding that they're putting into the Asian movement. And if they are willing to give funding for long-term, for multi-years, and if they're willing to, support an organization as it grows over time, as opposed to just giving funding for 2 or 3 years and then rescinding that offer as well. Yeah, so that's kind of a general overview of it. I think that there is a lot of opportunity for growth, as as the report has shown, that we really do need a lot more funding coming in, but we also need to ensure that that funding is coming in a sustainable way, so that we can work with organizations and ensure that their growth remains healthy as well.
Absolutely. And that's also something that we've noticed in our work through GAPC with grassroots NGOs in Asia as well, that a lot of times these organizations secure funding to get projects off the ground. But due to the lack of sustained funding during the long term, it often gets hard for them to continue operations, impacting not just the program, but the organization as a whole at times. So yeah, the lack of long-term funding is something we have touched upon in the report as well. So thank you so much for bringing that up. Wanyi, any thoughts on this?
My perspective on the current funding landscape in Asia might be a bit more narrowly scoped to Southeast Asia. That's where we think a lot more about in geographical region. It seems that the funder interests have been increasing and they do prioritize this region. My understanding is that Southeast Asia and Asia in general, the industrial animal agriculture is huge and it's growing, not likely to plateau. So I believe that funders' interest will remain high on this region. But I also think that it seems that how to give the funding is also a challenge, because we don't really have a level of the number of decades where the movement exists. It's just much fewer, and we are more nascent in this region. So I think interest is there, but the way that we are able to find talent and organizations to give the funding, I think there's still an evolving space. And I also think that in a sense, our current sources of funding is still very Western-based. It seems that there are very few Asia-based donors, not completely none, but there are just very little interest in trying to fund animal welfare work. But maybe for veganism work, there has been a lot longer standing of vegan groups doing more for a much longer time. So there might be some interest there, but I'm not as familiar, and I would try not to comment too much. In general, I also think that there is a challenge for plant-based movement funding as well. From what I could see in Singapore, those groups probably have smaller donors as compared to bigger philanthropic funding that we see in the last few years for farm animal welfare organizations. So this is my understanding of the current landscape in Southeast Asia. And how we see it evolving, or would like to see it evolving, is hopefully the stream of funding continues to come in, and hopefully the regions, organizations is able to be even more coordinated. I think right now it's great to see that many organizations have done various levels of work while more watching the welfare space. So a lot more layer hands work is being done. But I'm actually also very interested to see if we would see funding for welfare work for other types of animals, because besides layer hens, we have a lot of broiler chickens in this region, just like other parts of the world. And actually, ducks are farmed in such large numbers that we almost don't hear about them at all. And we were very interested to see would there be any more opportunities for some of these animal welfare to be able to progress with resources. It's not just simply about being able to put money somewhere and someone do the work. I think the responsibility of how to do what is good standard of animal welfare is a really tricky one. So I do think that it would be great to see more strategies for other types of animal welfare issues. I think that there is definitely a huge challenge and not simply about moving money over to this part of the world. And the role that capacity building organizations can play, and I think we do have different types of capacity building organizations in this region. Some organize more events, including the Asia Farm Animal Day. It's a really big conference, but there are also smaller events that do capture the talent pool and the interests. We also have people who target different approaches in doing programs. While Welfare Matters does a more family welfare-oriented program, we do appreciate other organizations whose program is very different from ours, but captures another type of talent pool. So I think that different capacity building organizations can play a role in capturing the different types of talent pool and community in Southeast Asia, as well as helping us all to collectively build up knowledge. This report is one form of bridging the knowledge gap. And with more knowledge, I think that we all can strategize better on what can be more impactful to do in this region.
Thank you so much, Wanyi. And I think you touched upon a very important point that even we were discussing about last week at AFA as well, is to expand the definition of farmed animals itself. Because even like within Asia, different countries have different animals that are farmed but don't typically farmed under the current farmed animal definition. For example, you mentioned ducks. There are civet in Vietnam that are used for coffee, but civets are still categorized as wild animals, which they are, but they're still farmed in large numbers for food. And of course, I'm sure there are like different animals in different spaces. So how can we expand the definition of farmed animal welfare to include such animals as well? So yeah, thank you for that. Now, moving on how Thrive operates. So is there a particular criteria that you use when deciding which organizations or projects to fund? And are there any particular areas within the farmed animal welfare movement in Asia that you believe needs more attention or resources?
Yes, very good question. So with Thrive, we intentionally try to avoid being too restrictive. And the reason that we do this is because we are working with multiple countries, multiple cultures. We're working with, 70 or more countries every single year. And we recognize that we are not an expert in all of these countries. We are not an expert in all of these cultures. And we want to ensure that the strategic decision-making and the autonomy remains with the local leadership and with the grantees themselves. So for this reason, we don't put too many restrictions on the type of projects we'll fund or the exact strategy we'll fund and so forth. Essentially, what we say is that if it is a strategy that works to reduce factory farming, works to reduce the consumption of animals, that works to create plant-based food systems, then we are open to looking at that proposal, whatever the strategy may be. And then we do have some other just basic criteria like cost efficiency, strong leadership, just these typical things. And another thing is that we like to prioritize funding domestic groups and local groups as opposed to chapters of a large international Western organization. And the reason that we are choosing to do this is because, again, we want to ensure that the leadership and the decision-making remains local within the local country and that there's not too much influence coming from the West in terms of the type of strategies that can be used and so forth. And, we end up funding a variety of tactics and a variety of campaigns and strategies simply because we are working with so many countries. So we are able to fund everything from public advocacy to public policy to working with institutions to replace animal products. So it's a variety of tactics that we end up funding. And one thing that we believe makes Thrive unique, one aspect that kind of makes Thrive a bit different from other funders, is that we don't only consider who we fund or what we fund, but we also think that it's equally important to consider how we fund. So we use an equity-based funding approach or a trust-based philanthropy funding approach. And essentially what this means is that we are, not only providing grants, but we're also actively working to dismantle the accessibility barriers to grants. So we're actively working to ensure that all organizations have equal access to our funding opportunity. And then we also work to actively dismantle the power imbalances that are commonly seen between grantees and funders. So we actively work to dismantle that power imbalance and ensure that we are considered an equal player with our grantees. So we're not this top-down hierarchical funder that is making commands on the grantees. We want to ensure that there's an equal partnership there. And then lastly, we also just intentionally work to avoid colonialism with our grant making. And what that essentially means is that we want to ensure that the strategic decision making remains domestic and remains with the local grantees, as opposed to the strategic decision making coming from our end as well. And so the second part of that question, so what are some areas that we believe need a bit more attention and resources? So what I have observed, and we also found this in the report as well, is that there tends to be not as much funding going into the vegan and diet change and meat reduction space as there is going into the farmed animal welfare reform space. And, animal welfare reform is very important. It's extremely important. And there's also, I feel like, because there's not as much funding going into the diet change and meat reduction space, that we are missing out on an opportunity. So I've had numerous conversations with grantees that discuss the fact that, because of the culture, because of the economic situation in the countries and so forth, that the public and policymakers just might not be as interested in animal welfare reform. It's just not seen necessarily as, a significant topic. However, if you were talking about diet change work and meat reduction work, and you're coming from a public health perspective and an individual health perspective and so forth, then you can have more, it's an opportunity to have more traction to be able to make these changes within the public sphere. So I do feel like not having as much funding going into actual vegan work and plant-based food systems work, that we might be missing out on a bit of an opportunity there to have some more effective approaches.
Thanks, Jessica. It's really interesting to learn about the kinds of systems and policies that you have set in place at Thrive, keeping in mind the different struggles that organizations usually face while applying for funding. So digging a little bit more in the same direction and talking about challenges. Now we know that funding in Asia comes with its own set of challenges. So what are some of the biggest hurdles that you have encountered when trying to fund projects in this region, and how do you navigate these challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the largest barriers that we have is a language barrier. There's so many different languages spoken. Unfortunately, our grants are in English. So the language barrier does create a major hurdle for potential grant applicants. Also, one hurdle is applicants having the awareness that we exist, the awareness that they can apply for a grant from us, and then also possibly applicants just not having the know-how of how to apply for a grant, of how to write a grant, how to submit a proposal, and so forth. So these have been some of the major barriers that we've encountered: language, awareness that we exist, and then just the applicant knowledge of how to apply for a grant. And so what we have done to work to overcome this, because that is an aspect that we feel is very important, is to actively dismantle these barriers. But some of the ways that we have worked to overcome this is that we have our Asia Funding Steering Committee, and then we also have an international advisory committee and board of directors. And what the members of these committees do is they will share within their networks, within their own countries, information about our grant. They will work to translate materials. They'll work with applicants to support them in applying for a grant as needed. But essentially, our steering committees, the aim of them is to just really get the information out there about the grant and ensure that applicants have whatever resources they need to be able to apply for a grant. And also, I feel like a good way that we have been able to help to overcome these barriers, not only for Thrive itself, but for the movement as a whole, is that we are an intermediary funder. So essentially, we work with major foundations who provide funding to our grant making pool, and then we redistribute that grant making pool out to grassroots organizations across the world. So we feel like at Thrive, working as an intermediary funder, it gives the major foundations and the major donors an opportunity to really tap into the network that we've created, the grantee applicant pool that we've created, and tapped into all of these systems we've put in place to overcome these funding barriers so that funding can get out in the most effective way possible. So that's another way I think that major foundations and major donors can work to overcome these barriers, is to tap into the resources of intermediary organizations such as Thrive. And one other barrier that I've encountered on multiple occasions is that it's not uncommon that I'll have a conversation with a potential applicant, or either myself or one of our steering committee members, and the applicant is a bit concerned about accepting funding from a Western funder. And the reason they're a bit concerned is they're afraid that the Western funder will then have too much control over the strategy that the organization is using. So essentially, it's not uncommon that an applicant might be a bit concerned that if they receive funding from a Western funder, that they might lose some of their strategic autonomy. And so for this reason, they're deciding not to apply for funding, or maybe they're a bit reluctant to apply for funding. So how we work to overcome this specific challenge, again, it's just having conversations, building trusted partnerships, and just ensuring that grantees are comfortable in knowing that we at Thrive aren't going to make top-down commands or suddenly take away their strategic decision-making and so forth.
Thanks, Jessica. That's really insightful. And I'm sure that a lot of our member organizations at AFA and any organization listening to this podcast, honestly, who's trying to raise funds would have found it really useful. Yeah, over to you, Wanyi. What are some of the biggest hurdles that you have encountered when trying to raise funds for welfare matters, which in itself is a capacity building initiative? Now, how do you navigate these challenges?
Yeah, I have to say that so far we are considered still quite lucky. I don't think that the luck will last, so we never take anything for granted. I think it was just the timing of starting the very first fellowship. At the end of 2021, there were interests in seeing such capacity building happening in this region. So we were very lucky to get the first set of grants for running the fellowship. And because the fellowship was gaining traction and we were seeing people actually being able to find jobs in this region from the very first fellowship, we were able to get funding relatively steadily so far. But I would say that I do see a challenge coming up, since we might be hitting the maximum of the number of bigger programs that we can do. And the hurdle will probably be, how do we communicate and demonstrate the counterfactual value and the impact that we have? And currently, I think that we're not just a job placement agency. We're really trying to bring in the right people with the right attitudes and the right end mind to join the movement, to strengthen it, so that more work can be done as soon as possible, and we reduce the suffering of our animals by as much as possible. But it's actually really challenging because some countries do not have organizations existing much in this region. That's one challenge in linking the fellowship to getting people into jobs. Some countries, it might be language barrier, that even though we might have been able to provide the entry into the movement by removing English as a language barrier, but many organizations still require people to speak English or be able to work in English to be able to be hired. And we think that this is just the current landscape that we're seeing, but perhaps over time we might be able to address that. And there are also challenges such as the timing. We only run the fellowship once a year. So we're still thinking about how do we capture the talent pool that is from the talent pool that is not necessarily captured because they cannot join our fellowship at the time that we are running it. So we're reviewing throughout the year Are there any other ways to capture them, as well as be able to understand the job openings and job market situation with the existing organizations in this region? This is something that we're continuing to analyze in order to be able to make sure that we fulfill the mission that we are here for. And it's still a bit of a challenge. So maybe being able to communicate those well enough and being able to reach the goals in a timely way would be a challenge that I can foresee Welfare Matters facing coming up. But so far, we are really lucky to have the resources that we need to do the work that we want to do.
Thanks, Wanyi. Now, coming down to the last question, now, as we look into the future, what do you think are some of the key steps that both funders and even organizations in Asia need to take to strengthen the farmed animal advocacy movement in the region? We can start with you, Wanyi.
I'm not so sure about, I think it's a lot about coordination and a lot of conversations, which I think people are having by means of meeting each other at conferences or having continued conversations after those events, or like AFA has organized the coalition meetings. I think these conversations allow us to continue to evaluate what's the landscape like. I think some key steps might be, how do we diversify a funding pool beyond just Western funders? I think it came up with a report as well, but I don't really see that that's something that might necessarily happen in the next few years. I think the awareness of this issue and the landscape that we are working in, it's a really big hurdle for getting more Asia-based donors to care about farmed animals' welfare. And I think that strengthening the movement, a lot of organizations are really talking and doing a lot. For example, organizations working on lay your hands cage-free movement issues, they seem to be very, very well coordinated. And I think it'll be great if we can see more organizations working on other welfare issues coordinate more as well. Although we actually have very few organizations working on other welfare issues besides lay your hands. I think as by capacity building organizations, we can continue to try to see where are the gaps and who's filling in which gaps, because I think different organizations taking different approaches actually is a good thing for the movement. That means that we are attracting different types of people and bringing in more people into this space, and different diversity can contribute a lot to strengthening the movement, not just with one perspective and one particular set of network. I do think that we need to figure out which are the key stakeholders that we have not been able to engage. I think so far the movement, because of how nascent it is, it's still targeting a few types of key stakeholders, but we might want to think about how to advance engagement in certain groups who already have interest in animal welfare issues and who can help champion the cause, maybe not in necessarily the farmed animal advocacy approach that we usually talk about. That could potentially help the movement go beyond the NGO space and be more mainstream with the interests. But this is actually a very general comment. I want to caveat that. I think it would take a lot more folks listening to this should reach out to more organizations in the region to get more inputs on, how we can do better.
Thank you so much, Wanyi. Jessika?
Yeah, absolutely. I think an important step that an organization can take if they're looking for the opportunity to grow, to take on more funding, is to connect with a capacity builder like AFA or like Thrive or any of the other capacity builders. Because when an organization connects with these capacity builders, they're not only able to gain skill sets and resources and tools, but they're also able to tap into the network of the capacity builders in terms of reaching out to novel funders, being introduced to novel funders, and so forth. So I think if an organization, if they're really looking for the opportunity to grow, to take on more funding, one of the key first steps they could take is ensure that they are tapping into a capacity builder, contacting you at AFA, contacting me at Thrive, and so forth. Then on the funder side, I feel like, it kind of goes without saying, but just putting more funding into the Asian movement, putting more funding into a variety of tactics. So not only farmed animal welfare work, but also more funding opportunities for plant-based food systems of work, meat reduction work, and so forth. And then also, I think one thing that funders could do is, like I mentioned before, is to tap into intermediary organizations like Thrive, because we already have all the systems in place to be able to fund these organizations all across the world. We already have the effective funding policies in place that ensure that organizations are able to reach their full potential and work in a way that is most strategic in their region and culture. So that could be another aspect for major foundations and major donors too, is if you want to partner with an intermediary organization like Thrive. In this way, you ensure that the funding gets out in the best way possible. But yeah, that's just kind of an overview of some of the areas that I've observed and some of the key takeaways I feel would be useful for the movement moving on in the future.
Thanks, Jessica. And of course, like brilliant points, both of you. I think we've captured the essence of the next steps that we need to take and continue taking to strengthen the movement in Asia. So thank you so much for your valuable insights. And before we wrap up, is there anything else that you'd like to add or any final thoughts on the report or the future of the movement in Asia? Wanyi, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, I think the team is just super generous to credit so many people, and I think it's great that the team was able to look at so much data and trying to make sense of it. That I know that Greg Pavitra and Tan, you all were thinking like, are you evaluating everything correctly and well? It just seems that there's no end to trying to analyze the data that accurately. So I feel like this is a great start and a conversation starter. We build on from there, and hopefully we can talk more about approaches and strategies to strengthen the movement from these data points onwards. So yeah, just want to say a big thanks for the team for the effort to crunch the data and then make sense of the movement for us all.
Thank you so much, Wanyi. I think you've been a very core part of the drafting of the report. So thank you so much for your contributions. Jessica?
Yeah, my final thoughts are it was such a pleasure to work on this report with AFA. I think that it is an extremely valuable report. It's offered a lot of insight into the movement. I think it's going to be extremely useful for, particularly within the funding space, to ensure that we are getting the funding out exactly where it needs to go. And then the last thing I want to say, if there's anyone out there, if you aren't familiar with Thrive and you would like to learn more about our grants, you can go to our website, which is thrivephilanthropy.org. You'll be able to apply for a grant and see all the other opportunities that we have as well.
Thank you so much, both of you. And thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in. If you found this discussion helpful, please do share it with your network and don't forget to check out the full report at Farm Animal Coalition/reports. We also have an interesting and exciting panel discussion on the same topic on Asian funding landscape happening at the Asia Farm Animal Day, which is taking place in Hanoi, Vietnam from the 9th to the 11th of October this year. And we really hope to see you there. And until next time, stay tuned and keep advocating for change.
Thanks for listening. You can find everything you need to know about our work and connect with us at asiaforanimals.com. Tune in for the next episode. Asia for Animals Coalition, a united voice for Asia's animals.